Hear a little bit of the entire range of different varieties of ways to explore this medicine. I'm going to look a little bit more at sort of some of the research that's happening right now. As probably many of you know from the newspaper, there's lots of great articles right now. So, some research is happening at some of the major institutions on psilocybin, and so I'll touch on that a little bit. But I also had to bring my notes. Because without PowerPoint, I find that I just have to make a slide out of each piece of paper, so I don't know how that works. So, my name is Larry. I am a PhD candidate at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a transpersonal psychology school in San Francisco. I am studying ayahuasca experiences, so I'm specifically looking at catalysts of transformation, like a death and rebirth experience, a Kundalini awakening experience, near-death experience, things like that. And in those experiences, specific to ayahuasca reports from Western speakers, so it's a little bit more relatable, something that can maybe connect with a little bit deeper than traditions that I'm not familiar with. I'm looking for, how many people here have had ayahuasca experiences before? Yeah, quite a few actually. Many of you probably know that a lot of times when you have these experiences, there's sort of these insights that come through, and there's sort of these direct experience, these homework assignments almost that you have. And since we're still kind of exploring how do we integrate with ayahuasca, you know, this isn't something that's very typical in traditions because the cosmologies are set up so there really isn't so much of a cognitive dissonance. Like, we're in a Western world where we're told spirit doesn't exist, we're told that we can reduce things down to a neuron, we're told that anything that we can't measure is non-existent. So for us, when we have an experience of spirit, there's going to be a much bigger gap for us to cross over than some of these traditions where spirit is sort of in the conversation from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed. When the cosmology is different, relates differently to integration. And I was talking to my mentor recently, and speaking to integration is almost like the sticking point of the emotional paradox. When something, the cognitive dissonance happens, and it's so great and it's so unlike what you're expecting to see, this creates like an emotional paradox, and that's where the sticking happens. And integration is sort of unpacking and loosening sort of that emotional paradox. So that's what I'm looking at in my dissertation. And when I'm all said and done, hopefully I'll have a nice variety of catalysts for transformation that are occurring across quite a few different experiences, and then also some techniques and ideas for people when they're working with integration. Obviously, as I mentioned before, I'm also co-founder and executive director of ERIE. We're a nonprofit now. Yes, if you ever have to go ahead and do nonprofit paperwork, kudos to you. It's not an easy task. I know some people back there have been through that process. So those of you who are looking at doing that, it's amazing. Get it done because it opens up a lot of doors. But just so you know, the zeitgeist feels much more open than it ever was. The lady from the IRS actually called and had a conversation with me about how she went through the process of accepting our 501c3. So just kind of speaks to, you know, a lady from the IRS being like, yeah, I watched a few of your videos, it's super interesting, wow, this is great, psychedelics and entheogens. Oh yeah, sure. So keep pushing down a little, keep sort of pressing against the edges because it is possible and things are happening. And so for me, you know, when I got the call last year to sort of explore this 920 coalition, I talked with the gentleman, Nick, who was with Layla working on this, and I was really fascinated because for me, mushrooms, this is kind of where I started. This is my psychedelic birth, so to speak. You know, when I came into this world, it was from a mushroom experience. I was actually super lucky as well. I was able to sort of come into the mushroom work from somebody who wasn't like, hey, let's go do these mushrooms and go to this party and have fun, woo, which is great too, and nothing wrong with that. She was much more intentional, so my initial experiences were, eat this whole bag, close your eyes, turn off the lights, turn off the music, see you in 5 hours. That's quite an interesting way to kind of start. You know, you start to learn about the inner experience, and you know, it's amazing how much of an experience it is when you close your eyes, and how as beautiful it is to see wavy lines and walls that kind of breathe. You know, this is, you know, if you close your eyes, it, you know, ups even more. So for me, starting off with mushrooms in my experiences, and then mushrooms also were the experience that kind of really spoke to me about integration is important. And this was probably, I don't know, I was like 20, 21 years old. You know how you have that bag of mushrooms, a big bag of mushrooms, and when you're, you know, when I was younger at least, you always first thought is, these are bunk. This isn't, maybe it's not going to be any good, right? So you get that hard head, trying to go through this like experience, and after a little while I sort of forgot that I even ate mushrooms, and then all of a sudden it hit me. And I mean, I can talk about the experience some other time if you like, but just like, you know, maps and maps and maps of all this information that I was like reading with my temples, it felt like it was like alien, very much like Diana Slattery's type of xenolinguistics work, very, very beautiful. But I walked around Ann Arbor for 4 o'clock a.m. to 6 a.m. just looking for somebody to talk to, because I was like, what just happened? And I had had quite a few mushroom experiences before that, so you just never know. You could be very well experienced, and then there's that one experience that just takes you to a place, and no matter how experienced you are, integration is something that becomes really important in this work. So that's you know, my connection to mushrooms, and why I was really excited when the 920 Coalition decided to do this work, because you know, yeah, I really enjoy them. You know, they sort of traditionally, the Mazatec tradition, they're called the little children, so they have that sort of playfulness to them as well, which I really enjoy. But we're not going to just talk about my mushrooms experience as much as I'd love to. This is an integration session for me. So we're going to talk about some of the current studies that are happening. So how many people here are pretty familiar with the studies that have been happening so far? Okay, most never enough people. Well, I'll do an overview just in case. So the basic ones that I kind of chose to talk about, the first one was the Johns Hopkins study in 2008. That one was pretty significant because it was speaking about healthy normals. And so a lot of times in the biomedical world, it's sort of treating a pathology, treating a sickness, treating something to that extent. This was, what do these experiences do for somebody that's totally healthy? How can we, you know, I think the word they use is the betterment of well-being, right? How can we achieve a better growing process from somebody that doesn't need this to cure some, you know, other thing, but just from an exploration of the healthy state. They found in that studies that 75% of the people given the right setting and dosage had one of the most top 5 most important experiences of their life, and that was measured up against the birth of their children and the death of their parents, and some pretty, you know, big experiences. So, and that held for like 12 months afterwards, which is also pretty amazing. The next studies, which I've been really fascinated about, and this kind of speaks to Layla's talk earlier about the NYU interview, and these are the studies at UCLA and NYU. They're sort of regurgitating some studies that were done in the 60s with LSD and end-of-life anxiety, but I think it's kind of an interesting switch because, you know, to go from LSD to mushrooms, mushroom kind of speaks a little bit more to that death, you know, archetype, right? And so what's happening is that people are having these experiences, sort of they're afraid of what's going to happen once they pass on, and this is alleviating some of their existential angst, some of their existential angst, but anxiety, you know, what's going to happen when I die. For me, this is fascinating because it's not often you hear the biomedical paradigm speaking about something that happens after you die. Usually the biomedical paradigm stops when you die, it's done, right? They're speaking to something that's after you die, this transpersonal space beyond. So I think that's a really interesting enmeshing of these two worlds that are coming together. And some another research project is, it's actually 3 different universities are doing something, and they're all talking about it in a different way. I think the best option is just to talk about it as addiction therapy. Because, for example, Alabama is doing one for cocaine addiction, University of New Mexico is doing one for alcohol addiction, and then Johns Hopkins is doing one for smoking cessation, and that's kind of getting a lot of the press right now. It's kind of weird, only because it's, you know, again, this is why I'm talking about addiction, because smoking cessation, tobacco is actually a major master plan in the pharmacopoeia, so to use mushrooms to stop tobacco kind of doesn't really make sense, but if you're talking about addiction for smoking cessation or addiction to cigarettes, that makes a little bit more sense. So as we sort of explore these biomedical studies, I think it's important to really get to the meat of what's happening and not kind of, oh, this is to stop smoking or this is to stop these other things, but kind of look at these under layers of what's going on. Some studies that are happening in England right now, the Beckley Foundation. So they have a lot of studies looking at mushrooms as antidepressants or anti-anxieties or anti-anxiety medications, and also they're the ones that have the fMRI study where you see the really super hyper-connected brain pre-mushroom, post-mushrooms, and the mushroom brain just like super lit up and all these different connections. So that's pretty fascinating too, the fMRI studies that are happening. And was anyone paying attention this summer to how these kind of studies made it out into? It's actually kind of fascinating. We actually, it's way down on our Facebook page, but we actually did something or a couple of weekends where every hour we would post a different major news article on the same papers, but typical of sensationalist media, right? You have all these different news articles talking about the same paper with different titles that don't make sense. This, this thing strengthens your sense of self. This thing dissolves your boundaries. I guess it's kind of paradoxical. Do they mean to be paradoxical? Maybe, but so I think this is also, as we look at the way that media is sort of coming into these studies and sharing these studies, we should also be aware of how these sensationalist titles might sort of affect our idea of what's actually happening. Try and read the paper a little bit farther than the press article as well.
Larry, there's a video that's called Your Brain on Psilocybin by Carhart Harris, YouTube. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I haven't seen that yet.
It's over an hour long. It's very comprehensive and detailed. It's all the studies of brain mechanisms.
fMRI studies and stuff? Yeah. We'll talk about that in a second.
Freud, everything.
So, what is it again one more time? Brain on psilocybin?
Brain on Psilocybin, yeah.
Okay.
Robin Carhart.
Robin Carhart. Has Robin Carhart Harris had any experiences?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I heard him say on one thing that he had, maybe it was LSD. He didn't have any LSD experiences. That's that. So,
You should.
yeah, right, we should, right? Hopefully. That's the idea, right? Hopefully we're also doing the actual personal studies too, right? So are many people familiar kind of with the lineage of how psilocybin got to the laboratory in the first place? No? Okay, so basically this tracks from Maria Sabina and the Mazatec tradition in Mexico, right? And over the course of time, Gordon Wasson came across Maria Sabina. Gordon Wasson was the guy in the Life magazine that kind of like, in 1957, kind of blew up into the underground culture. But what's interesting is that they were exploring the mushrooms in Mexico. Somewhere along the way, they decided that they want to take these mushrooms and bring them into the Western world. At the same time, I'm sorry?
Didn't Larry go down there and try to find her?
This was later.
Okay.
Yeah, because he didn't get the psilocybin, I think, till after Hoffman synthesized, right? I think.
Was it Castaneda was bringing some back to
No.
I don't think so, no.
The first was a guy named Weidlander, a Mexican anthropologist. He's the one who led Gordon Wasson.
And then from Wasson, it was John Moore and a French mycologist,
the
right?
director of the National Museum of Anthropology, Museum of Man in Paris, also went.
Right, yeah. And he's who sent it to Albert Hoffman, right?
Yes, and
Yeah.
they published a fascinating book. It's called Les Champignons Hallucinogènes du Mexique. It's a 1,000-page monograph.
So very happy that the French mycologist was there, because what's sort of hidden in the story is that there were two people with Wasson. There was this French mycologist that you're speaking of, but then there's also John Moore. Does anyone know who John Moore is? So I also didn't know who John Moore was until recently, and I saw this piece of an article on the University of Delaware, and they're giving away this scholarship, a $400 scholarship for organic chemistry for this guy, John Moore. Oh, what's this all about, right? Read a little bit more. John Moore, according to the very biased article, was the one who gave the psilocybin mushrooms from Maria Sabina to the CIA. You're like, oh no, I don't. You're giving a scholarship away for that? What's happening? No. But that's kind of that's kind of the direction, So John Moore told the CIA that he would be able to isolate the compound and was beaten by Albert Hoffman, who actually did end up isolating the compound through this French mycologist you're speaking of. So it just kind of shows you how it was real close. It could have gone into the hands of some pretty unsavory characters. So, but that kind of just shows the lineage. So we have this mushroom, it's considered playful, little children. It's used in these traditions, used in these ritual ceremonies, really beautiful. And then it becomes a molecule through these ways that maybe today we wouldn't see as being totally kosher, but okay, that's where we're at today. And now this is the molecule that's being used in the studies and everything like that. And it's one of the few 4 different psychoactive compounds in mushrooms. So I'll talk about that in a second. So this whole talk actually is going to be, from here on out, is going to be a little bit of a critique. So love the studies. I'm super happy that biomedical studies are doing what they're doing. I know that I have used those biomedical studies to talk about and convince people on a plane, in a line at the grocery store, at a bank, and people say, what do you study? And I'm like, oh, I'm going to study this thing, right? And so oftentimes it's the biomedical research institutes which make people say, okay, I've heard of Johns Hopkins. Oh yeah, UCLA. Oh, NYU. Okay, this is great. And that's a good way to move forward. My only concern right now is that we may be getting into a space where, take this with a grain of salt, we might be entering the tyranny of psychedelic science, if you will, right? Everyone wants these works, this research to move the policy forward. So are we becoming a little bit lax on our our looking at some of these academic studies? Should we be a little bit more on it and be, really bring to light some of the things that psychedelics don't really allow to have happen in the laboratory? There's certain things that are consistent with psychedelics, as I mentioned in the abstract, that there's no way to measure. The spirit, mysticism, setting, all these things are conundrums in the world of science because it's not repeatable. You can't reduce it down to the minimum. So basically what I'm trying to do here is just show how we can talk about these experiences from the Biomedical Institute. All of us here have had probably experiences, and we probably have some insights into different ways that can help some of these methodological challenges that are happening. So, first challenge. Before we start, does anyone have any ideas of some, outside of set and setting, and outside of spirit and mysticism, any ideas of what might be a challenging thing for psychedelics within a laboratory? Yeah. Oh.
Well, I was going to say something regarding set and setting. Just
Sure.
the clipboard and the lab coat can really get into the experience.
It's the same. I'll break into that a little bit more. At number 2, exactly. And even, well, I'll get in a second.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any ideas or thoughts? Yeah. Alexis.
Feeling like whatever your experience is being pathologized.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Is this sort of like any natural medicine where it's really hard to know exactly how much of the active ingredient is being cultivated from crop to crop?
Yeah, I think they're. Yeah, that probably because from the different mushrooms and different traditions, I think they're trying to be pretty specific. Like this dose is this amount, da da da. But yeah, that's really important. I think that maybe speaks to the entourage effect as well a little bit. I saw a hand back there in the back.
Oh. That sense of like synchronicity where you start to get tapped into either the people you're with and you sync up and it's like magic. They just say things that you were thinking, or something happens, it shows up and it's like a magical synchronicity, that kind of synthesizing with the world around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, synchronicities, parapsychology, all these very unusual spaces. Yes, true.
The challenge would be not being able to know what's actually going on for the person in the moment. Because if they're not speaking, then you have no idea what their internal experience is.
From the perspective of the facilitator to the experiencer. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. Yes.
Like the visual aspects of what the person can see.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be kind of hard to explain.
Right, the inner experience, ineffability. Yeah, exactly. Well, you guys are great. One more back there, and then.
I think opening the mind's consciousness is something that we haven't figured out how to make computers do. So it's therefore a very innately human thing.
Yes.
Sure. Like I hear often the idea of hacking consciousness, right? Which how can you hack inside of something that you're? I know you don't believe that though.
But expanding the mind is something very human. Mm-hmm. That if you find that as an opportunity, extraordinary things just seem to happen in your life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, maybe again to the synchronicity that she was speaking to a little bit. Yeah. Well, you guys are great. I think you just gave my whole talk. So, I'm sorry. If you guys want to add more to the talk, I don't have to say anything now. You guys are good.
Hearing the noises around you, depending on what kind of your warehouse, when you're somewhere busy, or a soundproof chamber, all that would create a different kind of feel for you as the recipient or the test.
Sure. Yeah, definitely in the setting aspect there. That's definitely probably a setting quality where you're like, is it sound or lack of sound or whatever. Yeah. There you go.
I was just thinking a lot of subjects aren't actually able to get into the studies because of prior use of psychedelics or mental health diagnoses or lack of money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I just heard an awesome podcast, Dimitri actually, from Psychedelic Times, and he went off on that, and it was pretty awesome, powerful. If you guys have an opportunity to see that.
What's it called?
Who said that? I'm sorry.
What's the podcast called?
I think it's Psychedelic Times, and the guy's name was Dimitri.
Mugianis.
What's his last name?
Mugianis.
Mugianis, yeah. And you have a pretty awesome talk on that. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, do you have any other like podcasts that you recommend, like psychedelic?
I can recommend them to you later, but I want to share the rest of my talk. I don't know. But yes, definitely there's tons of great ones. And I think there's new ones popping out. I think Eric Davis is amazing. If you ever get a chance, Dublin, okay, he's got one. So some of the list of the challenges, which many of you had already kind of touched on. The first one, which I think is interesting, and actually Nick Cozy, he gave a talk a little while ago at CIS for us, and he kind of touched, I'm pretty sure it was Nick Cozy, and he was speaking to the fact that, not many people know this, but the psilocybe mushrooms actually have 4 psychoactive alkaloids in them, right? So it's not just psilocybin, which is being tested. So all the tests, all of the studies that are happening are just about psilocybin. As you know, with cannabis, marinol is not THC. Synthetic THC doesn't do the same thing as if you smoke the flower, because there's terpenes and there's CBD and THCA and all these other varieties of things called the entourage effect. There's also an entourage effect in mushrooms. There's psilocybin, psilocin, baeocystin, and norbaeocystin. So all 4 of those work together. The baeocystin and norbaeocystin are a lower level psychoactive, but we don't really know how they interact yet. So again, there's an element of sort of science has to reduce down to a single component, and then what are we missing by just reducing down to that single component? The second thing we were touching on, set and setting, ritual and ceremony. You're speaking to set and setting. Steve Byer gave a talk once, which was fantastic, and he set the container for showing that the biomedical also has a magical ritual, right? You get in the waiting room, you talk to the person, you sit back down, you get in the office, the nurse comes in, she takes your blood pressure, she leaves, the guy with the white coat comes in, he has a stethoscope on, he does his thing, he leaves, and this whole process, this whole ritual magical ceremony. And I know for people that, my father, for example, who's really into that system, there's magic in that. The belief, it's a low-level placebo, but there is a strong belief in this thing that's working. So it really speaks to what kind of magic the biomedical system uses, but is that the same magic that psychedelic medicine uses? I'm not so sure. Possibly. But if you look at like some of the traditional settings, it's a little bit more, ritual. There's an altar. There's more sort of a spirit involved in that. Also, another thing that I think is interesting about the set and setting and ritual and ceremony conversation is that oftentimes when people talk about psilocybin, they're like, oh, psilocybin totally has a spirit. Albert Hoffman gave it to Maria Sabina. He gave her 5 grams. A while ago she had it. She said, oh yeah, the spirit's in here. But she didn't take it in his lab in Switzerland. She took it in the place where she does her ritual and her ceremony, where she's always singing her songs and where all the people are always at. So what's the power of the place? How much of that spirit was already there? And the psilocybin was just the key to open that door. I don't know. But also, maybe it's a possibility that there was just a powerful spiritual energy already in the space, and had she taken this somewhere else, it might not have had that same spirit. We don't know. It's good to study. Third one would be experienced facilitators and participants. I've heard a few people at different institutions say that they believe, I'm checking my time here, so they say they believe that the facilitators don't actually have had to have had an experience in order to administer the experience. And some people totally agree, that's great. I think it's a little different though, for me, because for those of us that have had these experiences, sitting for somebody is not just watching their body in the room. There's a whole transpersonal world out there. And if the facilitator doesn't even have a clue that transpersonal world exists, how can those other containers be held? You can hold the container of that person, you can make sure that they're safe, but there are other things happening. And so I think it would behoove the facilitators to also have the experiences. Maybe they are having the experiences, and due to legality, they're not allowed to talk about it, but I think it's really important for some sort of understanding. And this also speaks to, you're saying earlier about the naive participants, same thing. All the people, because of the restrictions of science, we want to make sure that they're not, corrupted by their previous experiences, so they have to be novices, they have to be never had these experiences before, but and I'll speak about this in the ineffability part, but that doesn't lead to a lot of very interesting phenomenological research, because it's mostly, wow, and this thing, and could you believe, and whoa, and that's interesting, it shows a lot of emotion, but as far as from, I'm very interested in consciousness and the phenomenology of consciousness, it doesn't tell me a lot about what's happening in the experience. So if we can get a better language around that by having less than naive participants, it might be helpful. Another thing, somebody spoke about this, the pathology, right? So framing the conversation, I think you said this, Alexis, right? Are mushrooms an antidepressant? Are mushrooms an anti-anxiety? Are mushrooms, I read this today, reverse PTSD? Geez, I thought they were pro-wonder, or pro-awe, or pro-amazingness, or wow, could you believe this? But to frame it in antidepressant or anti-anxiety, although they may be doing that, I think is doing a disservice to the mushrooms in that they're not something to make us feel slightly better so we can re-emerge into a depressing world. It's to make us feel stronger so we can help change the depressing world out there and feel less depressed, our ability to act, right? So the next one I'm going to talk about briefly, because it's kind of complicated. Is anyone familiar with the Hood's mystical experience reports? So a lot of the hallucination or the mystical rating scale that they use is from a guy named Dr. Hood. Really great studies, really great work. He's basing everything off of William James from 1902 and a sort of working of that from the W.T. Stace in about the 60s. But what he found when he was actually looking at his experience reports is that he found that really only about 2% of the people, when he did a content analysis, often had a full-blown mystical experience. And he had sort of 4 different criteria of biases that happen. You have sort of the indeterminate ante. So, this is about experience, about mystical experiences? No, I hate mystical experiences. So, indeterminate ante. Indeterminate bro, mystical experiences? Yes, I'm totally a starry-eyed mystic. Yes. So those are biases, right? Then you have the intrinsic and extrinsic biases. And I think this is what's really important for the NYU studies and things like that, is that intrinsic means when you do something because you love it. I paint because every day I paint, it makes me feel so good. Extrinsic is when you do something because it's to pay your bills. I paint because it helps me pay my bills and I gotta pay my bills. So his theory is that the intrinsic qualities have a higher level of mystical experience. So when people are going to cure their anxiety around death, is that an extrinsic factor? Would they have a higher level of mystical experience potentially? I don't know. This, last year I gave a talk on the mystical experience question and kind of unpacked it a little bit and really spoke to when you hear somebody say they had a mystical experience, how do you help them integrate? What type of mystical experience is that? This type of mystical experience or this type of mystical experience? So really kind of looking at this mystical rating scale and figuring out how can we get a little bit more polished with our understanding. And this speaks to the next question, which is effing the ineffable, which is a common term that's being used when you try to put words or define the ineffable. How many people here know that there's 3 or 4 definitions to the word ineffable? So, first one we know, right? Ineffable, couldn't possibly put words on it. It's way too challenging, it's just too far out there, right? That's the one we're most familiar with. The second one is, this experience is super sacred. This is something that's a core gem of mine, and I can't share it with people because it's here, it's for me. It's the second layer of ineffability. Hood also talks about a third layer of ineffability, and this is also, I think it was McKenna that said, the secret that can be told is not a secret. And this idea that something will always be ineffable unless the person you're speaking to has been to some similar place. Because even as we try to language it and we try and put words on it, there's no way to truly connect that person unless they're also familiar with these places. So that's kind of the third layer of ineffability. And this is also why, the novice and the naive participants in the studies, we're never going to get farther along with polishing down our ineffability, getting to that core nugget of what really is happening there, if the people that are having these explorations don't really have a languaging system for that. And again, speaking to languaging, this is what we find with integration is fantastic. It's really wonderful to be sitting in a circle with somebody and have somebody, it's not this, and it's not this, but it's kind of this. And an opportunity to practice new words and to practice a new language and say, hey, wow, people really understood what I was saying there. Oh, wow, they totally didn't understand that. And so to teach each other how and hold space for each other while we practice new language and new ways to turn these experiences. And let's see. One I spoke of a little bit earlier, to go real briefly on the materials reductionist paradigm kind of denies spirit anyway, so it's really hard to speak within that paradigm about spirit when, like I said, there's not really a system for that. It's not found in the brain somewhere. And then to the fMRI studies, which I know you're going to love this, but there's a recent fMRI study I found, and it was looking at salmon neurochemistry. And it found that had quite a bit of, response in the salmon. And the problem about the neural activity of the salmon was dead. So it's an interesting study, right? So they found recently that because of challenges, noise, effects, things like that, also a recent study that showed some software programs out there, 3 of the software programs, one of the designers made a faulty error, and so now 40,000 studies that use fMRI are suspect. And the data is hidden, so no one can double check it. So we're basing all of our research on what does an fMRI really tell us about psychedelics, what's happening? I mean, it shows where things are lit up, but what does that tell us? And should we base all of our information on this thing that potentially could be 40,000 studies? It's not even the researchers that made the mistake, it was the software programmers. So it's kind of a big challenge. And then the very last one, and then I'll get to your question in a second, is the idea of psychedelics in a capitalist society. Can we ever have real psychedelic work when we're constantly trying to sell it, we're constantly trying to market it, we're constantly trying to find the most effective treatment, but in a world that's a capitalist society, the most effective treatment is the one where I make you pay for the rest of your life. Not the one that you can do it once and never have to come back to. Right? Something that every month I saw this really fascinating, I was talking to my friend about Iboga, and saw this fascinating article that was basically like, oh yeah, we found a way to kick heroin. You just have to take the shot once a month for the rest of your life. It's not a total, you might withdraw, you might go back on heroin, but just once a month for the rest of your life, you won't be addicted to anything else. Just this one thing once a month for the rest of your life. Right? That's kind of the model, right? So how do we work with these experiences when at the base level they're bringing things, and they're also, bringing insights to what is the capitalist system, what's actually happening, what's happening to our earth, how are we extracting, resources from our earth and from ourselves. And, just kind of the last thing is the hope that we can get past the point that hopefully, and I don't know, maybe psilocybin isn't, I know MDMA isn't patentable, but it would be a real bummer if Big Pharma got a hold of the God pill and started charging $5 to $8 grand for that thing, So how do we also make sure that the reduction down to a simple molecular component and a strategy, which in, like, for example, the Johns Hopkins studies, the setting's the same, the music playlist is exactly the same, everything is exactly the same over and over and over again, and that's something that you can, market to people later. So how do we be aware of these things? How do we, keep an awareness around it and keep an integrity around it? Even though the work is great and it's fantastic, we know there are also some people out there who, the market's a big game. So those were the critiques that I had, and I'm sure there are probably many more, and I'd love to hear any questions anyone has. But yeah, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
I do.
Oh, I had some comment. Yes, I know about the critique about the fMRI glitch in the software, but they've corrected this. These people are pretty smart. They know what they're doing. The psilocybin fMRI studies have been replicated, and they've also done multimodal with PET scans and EEG and magnetoencephalography. So it's a big picture now, and it's pretty consistent. And they're also replicating this with ayahuasca, and so the default mode network is retarded.
Yeah, I'm really...
But there's subsections of it that still have to be worked out. So, but the science is pretty good science.
I'm super fascinated by the default mode network information, and speaking to that media thing that happened this summer, it was fascinating because they said that with the default mode network, with LSD, it helps you, time travel, or mental time, reduces mental time travel, I think was the name of the article, right? Reduces, so you think about anxiety of the past less with LSD, that's what a reduction in DMN is. When the psilocybin research came out, they said reduction in DMN means that you remember your past memories. So it's like, well, what is it doing? So I totally am very fascinated. I think that the DMN is like the sort of the neuronal ego, if you will, right? Like the filter that Huxley talks about. You take that filter out, you can experience more consciousness. But I don't know how much that's going to tell us about some of the inner experiences, which is where I'm fascinated about.
No, the DMN is what gives you your ego structure. It's your self-referential frame of reference. It's me, Larry, on psilocybin and having this experience and we're talking to each other.
So
Dial that
default
down.
mode network is resting state of this resting state.
It means default mode network is the resting state activity of the brain, which is vast. It's the network that has the most metabolic activity of all the other networks that we know, and it has lots of subdivisions. So you go out of the language editor, ego structures, and you drop into other parts of the brain. Here's a little quote. It says, it links.
You can't do research on your iPhone during the talk, that's not fair.
Yeah. So you get into the hippocampal structures and the connections to the anterior cingulate, and it drops you into a different, I like to call it a different room of consciousness. It's kind of like a more primitive way of perceiving reality. You go into this mystical, it's the spiritual brain. It opens the gates into the spiritual brain experience.
Yeah, I think I'm excited to see how it evolves. I hope, and this is a question that I have with many people, I hope that the biomedical will begin to be open to the mystical. I heard Nicholas Langowitz, who did this neuropsychedelia, who does the anthropology of psychedelic scientists, right? And he had one thing where one of the scientists were like, he's like, oh, I took ayahuasca and I can see some of these ideas that people are talking about spirit, it makes sense. And that guy's like, you're a starry-eyed mystic. And so like that's the worst thing you can call somebody in biomedical science, a starry-eyed mystic. I'm like, yeah, that'd be great, that's great, thanks. Is another question? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Amanda Eloesh. I'm a minister for Medicine Path Native American Church. I do legal San Pedro ceremonies and worked with an ayahuasquero for about 7-8 years and take people to the jungle for those ceremonies. And what I know when I'm in ceremony with all the people that I've studied with, and I know the history of all the use of entheogens throughout our ancestors and many different cultures, that that's still or once was the practice of healing, is that they listen to the plants. That's how they know how to use them. That's how they know how to prepare them. When I'm in ceremony, I don't know what's going to happen in ceremony because I'm listening to the plants. And so I'm curious about, with all the research, like what kind of emphasis or how do you even go about creating a sense of listening to what the plants would like as far as being studied, and how do we respect them? Because I know that if with our elders say with the tobacco, the use of the tobacco is an offering for the holy, and that's why we have so many problems with addiction. And so I feel like if we're not handling it, it's like this higher consciousness, but if we're not treating these sacred beings that are helping us to heal our lives, they are the ones expanding our consciousness. And so if we're not asking permission and how we deal with them, then I have some concerns. So I'm just curious if that's a part of what you're about, and how do you quantify it or even talk about it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely what we're about as an organization. That's something that we try at least to really focus on the ecological questions, on plant consciousness. I saw somebody quoted something recently, said the biggest miss in science today is the fact that nobody talks about plant consciousness. If you do, it's super fringe. You can't talk about that, and at the same time we have trees communicating through a fungal mycelial network under the ground, or you have giraffes eating a tree at the beginning and a tree of a different species at the end of the route makes their leaves bitter because that tree at the beginning has told them, hey, there's a giraffe coming, make your leaves bitter, there's danger ahead. That sounds like consciousness to me, but we've had these experiences, it's quite obvious, like really deep experiences. When you go places and you come back and you're like, there's no doubt anymore that there's so much more, and that there's a wisdom to some of these characters and these beings, and these traditions know that, and I think the earth is screaming for that right now. And you hear that a lot about with ayahuasca right now. There's this term reverse missionary. It needs to go out into the world to tell humans like, hey, you guys are messing up the planet. Now some people say that's kind of egoic mode or whatever, because that's humans saying, oh, we're the ones that are going to save the planet, and the earth doesn't care anyway because it'll still be going on once we're gone. But I think that really speaks to what is our relationship to these plants? What are they trying to teach us? Oftentimes as a mental fun experiment, I imagine that I'm the lowest on the totem pole. Not that we're like the most evolved beings, but we're actually the lowest, and the plants are the most evolved beings, or the slugs on the street are the most evolved. And it's a really nice way to sort of look at the world and see, what is it teaching us from that place, right? So I think you're right. I think plant consciousness is something, right? Fungus consciousness, since we're talking about fungus today, right? Fungus consciousness is really important as well.
Yes. I wanted to add to the fascinating topic. Jeremy Narby described it very well in the book, The Cosmic Serpent DNA. When he asked all these ayahuasqueros, you know, so how did you come up with this formula? Because there's 100,000 different species of plants in 1 acre. How did you combine chacruna with bikaki? And the answer is always the plants taught us. The plants showed us how to do this. So that statement offends every scientist, right? Because it's like, come on, this is trans-species communication. But if you grow up in the Amazon jungle, you're in that milieu. That's your world, and so that's not such an outrageous belief system to have, right? So we grow up in cities and we live in urban areas, most of us, and we don't have that connection to the plants. So some people do develop it.
And I think that speaks to something right there. And I guess we can't do psychedelic mushrooms here, since this is about mushrooms. But I think one way that I know that I try and work a little bit with plant consciousness is we don't have to, farm all the plants. We don't have to, make big gardens of beautiful plant work. I feel like if we just plant one plant, just one cactus or one coffee vine or one datura plant or one morning glory or anything, just kind of give energy to that plant and know that that plant's going to the earth. And if you can think of all of these as fruitings of the earth, we can just focus on one thing in front of us, then maybe that'll help, and that I think will help us reconnect to that.
Can I make one little recommendation?
Sure.
That I know it's commonly used, but it actually kind of hurts my heart when people talk about taking a medicine, like I took mushrooms or I took this, and because it's like it's an ownership, it's an old colonialist ownership of things, and when we start saying I've worked with this plant, I've journeyed with this, it kind of gives it some more respect. So I'd like to suggest that, and also learning about the origins, like cannabis. That's the oldest word for that plant, and so just kind of knowing the history, knowing the ancestors of these beings is really helpful. That's just a recommendation on how to start that conscious relationship on a personal level.
I agree. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, everybody. We can ask questions later, but we have to wrap up because we're going to do an awesome panel now with some question and answer. So thank you very much, and